Welcome back to Shatranj 64. Today we are covering a marathon battle between Gukesh D and Divya Deshmukh. This game lasted 102 moves, full of tension and resilience. Let's go through it step by step. Opening phase, Gukesh begins with the pawn to e4 and Divya replies with the pawn to c5, the Sicilian defense. The knight comes to f3, black develops the knight to c6. White plays the bishop to b5, pinning the knight. Black pushes the pawn to e5, gaining space. White castles the king to safety, black develops the bishop to e7. White places the rook on e1, black jumps with the knight to d4. White retreats the bishop to c4, black captures with the knight on f3 and the queen recaptures. Black develops the knight to f6, white supports the center with the pawn to d3 and both sides castle. Middle game tension, white develops the knight to c3, black strengthens with the pawn to d6. White pushes the pawn to a4, black develops the bishop to e6. White plays pawn to h3, stopping knight jumps, and black places the queen on d7. White advances the pawn to a5, black brings the rook to d8. White develops the bishop to d2, black plays pawn to h6. White's queen moves to e2, black repositions the knight to e8. White pushes the pawn to f4, black captures, and the bishop retakes on f4. Black develops the bishop to f6, white thrusts the pawn to e5. Black captures with the pawn, white retakes with the bishop, and black exchanges bishops. The queen recaptures, black checks with the queen to d4, queens are exchanged, and black's pawn recaptures on d4. White's knight jumps to e4, black's bishop moves to d5, and white advances the pawn to a6. Black blocks with the pawn to b6. Structural battles, white repositions the knight to d2, black exchanges with the bishop on c4 and the knight recaptures. Black's rook moves to d7, white's knight jumps to e5, black defends with the rook to d6. The knight returns to c4, black repeats with the rook to d7. White centralizes the king to f2, black develops the knight to c7. White lifts the rook to e5, black contests with the rook to c8. White's king moves to e2, black pushes the pawn to b5. White's knight retreats to a3, black's rook returns to d6. White's king marches to d2, black captures the pawn on a6 with the rook. White activates the rook to f1, black pushes the pawn to b4. White's knight jumps to c4, black places the rook on e8. White exchanges rooks, black recaptures with the knight, and white's rook swings to f4. Black defends with the rook to f6, white captures the pawn on d4 and black counters with rook to f2 check. Tactical phase, white's king steps to e3, black captures the pawn on g2 with the rook. White invades with the rook to d8, black defends with the king to f8. White's rook goes to a8, black's king moves to e7, and white captures the pawn on a7 with check. The kings dance, rook to a6 check, king to e7, pawn to c3, black captures with the pawn, white recaptures, and black checks with the rook to g3. White's king moves to d4, black captures the pawn on h3 with the rook. White's knight jumps to e3, black's knight to c7, white checks with knight to f5, black retreats the king to e8. White's rook swings to b6, black checks with knight to e6, white's king moves to c4, black's knight jumps to f4, but white captures with knight takes pawn on g7 check. Black stabilizes with the king to d7, white presses with the rook to b5, black counters with rook takes pawn on d3. White's rook moves to f5, black replies with rook to g3, white checks with rook takes pawn on f7, black's king retreats to d8. White's knight jumps to f5, black defends with the knight to g6, white's rook goes to a7. Black checks with knight to e5 and white's king steps to d5. Endgame grind, white captures with the king on e5. And here, after 82 moves, the players know the result is inevitable, the match will be drawn. But they continue until move 102, testing each other's technique and nerves. After 102 moves, the game officially ends in a draw. A true marathon of precision and resilience. Gukesh pressed, Divya defended, and both showed incredible fighting spirit. If you enjoyed this move-by-move breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to Shatranj 64.